Yeah. I don't know if y'all have heard that song before. It's an awesome song, but it's such a pop kind of song, and you guys did the 11:11 thing to it. Yeah, it was awesome. So connection, that's really about who we are, I think, at the heart of our being, right? We're wired to be in connection with one another, and of course, during the pandemic, that's been a real challenge for us. A lot of us have learned to adapt and find ways of being in connection in spite of the reality of this last 14 months or so. Some of us have found this connection online that is rich and is meaningful and is providing a sense of we're all still here together. And so it's really amazing how we've adapted to that. But there's also something at the root of this, the rootedness of this need to be connected I think we get it wrong. And as we come out of this pandemic, what it seemed to me is that we need to, Linda and I and others that I interviewed with during the early part of this pandemic, back in March and April, one of the things we kept talking about was kind of like our pre-pandemic self, our post-pandemic self. Who are we going to be when we come out on the other side of this? And I think we've still got a lot of processing to do before we figure that out. But my anxiety, of course, is that we rush into just being back to the way life, trying to get back to the way life was, or trying to get back to some kind of normalcy as though that defined normalcy. Well, the pandemic basically destroyed the definition of normalcy. The pandemic basically confronted what we always took for granted. And it reminded us that we are much more interconnected with the reality around us than perhaps we had taken seriously enough. So this series is important to me, this idea of thinking about who we are, how we are, why we are, as we look at the 5.5 movements of 11:11. And what I really want you to think about these movements is not simply just sort of like practices that we do, but these are also our strengths. Not simply as a community, these are our strengths as people. As human beings, these, I think, are some of our powers that we have that we don't use, that we tend to simply let someone else take the control over, take the wheel from us. So I'm going to go over them really quickly because I never really listed them all. I'm going to list them all real quick so that you kind of have an idea where we've been, where we're going. So here they are in a nutshell. Feel free to take notes. I didn't get them on the PowerPoint in time, so you can take notes. Or I'm going to put them up on our Facebook page later on so you can see them there again. So the first one that we talked about the first Sunday is invitation. Come, whoever you are. But it's not simply who we are as a community, inclusive, open-minded. That's not simply about here. It's about what we do out there, right? This is all practice. Worship, as I understand it, is really about how we learn to be in our day-to-day life, how we learn to be from moment to moment. So invitation is, how do you invite people into a space of connection, a space of inclusiveness, wherever you are? Even in those moments that are challenging, invitation, come, whoever you are. Imagine if you sort of said that to everyone you saw, especially the folks that kind of piss you off. They cut in front of you. They're grumpy at the line in the groceries, wherever you find them. Or they make you mad because they're on TV or they're on the radio and you're listening to the news. And what if you just stopped and said, come, whoever you are, right? That's invitation. Invitation is inviting everyone into this space of connection. And it's challenging because of how we see the world around us sometimes. It also is a part of how we invite others to find their own voice. Because there are lots of folks marginalized, obviously, who don't know that invitation, who can't experience that invitation because of the reality in which we live. That was the number one. Number two is asking better questions. We talked about how many of us have been on this spiritual journey of sort of deconstructing our faith, rethinking the ideas of our faith, rethinking how we understand spirituality, God, and all of those things. But it's also more than simply that. It's learning to ask questions that, again, move us back towards finding the connections, towards finding that interconnectivity with everyone. So instead of in 2001, when we were asking the question, who did this? Maybe the better question we should have been asking is, why did this happen? That's a hard question to ask because our defenses come up. Our anger comes up. Our pain comes up. Our brain takes over, our lizard brain, and we don't get to that place where we can transform the world around us, and we end up in the same patterns, right? In our relationships, who did this to me? I'm the victim in my relationship. When in fact, we should ask, why did this, right? Figuring out ways to ask bigger, larger questions, better questions. That's really a part of what we're about here, I think. The third thing is recognizing that the importance of story, and I'll get into that in a minute. The fourth is going to be appreciation and gratitude. The fifth is going to be mindfulness, which is very much a part of who we are in here. And then the half, which is sort of like it's my privilege. I can make it whatever I want to. It's really about the yes and. It's really about the yes and in life. There's just mystery. We don't always know what's coming. We don't always have control. We don't always get to say, but we always get to respond. Yes and. So these are our 5.5. So today I want to think about how we tend to orient our lives around these two primary stories. The story of separation or the story of interconnectedness. So here's what I mean by the story of separation. The story of separation, the myth of separation, is what mostly guides our lives in the West. We are individual. We live in a competitive world. Competition is celebrated. There are winners. There are losers. There are haves. There are have-nots. The story of separation is basically a binary orientation to the world. Others are there. There are people who are different from us, distinct from us, and we know who those folks are. It's a part of. It's almost like it's rooted even in a kind of idea of social Darwinism, but it goes much further back than that. It's seeing others as distinctive from us. It's seeing that our primary tribe defines who we are. Our primary culture defines who we are. Our primary church involvement defines who we are. And it's always in relation to who we aren't. This is the story of separation. It's the guiding myth that guides a lot of us. When we wake up and we feel like, well, we just haven't accomplished anything, we haven't succeeded, who's telling us that? Right? Where did that story come from? Who defines who we are and how we're supposed to be? And then we end up creating that narrative for ourselves. Where did that story come from? Well, for a lot of us, it came from childhood, right? I mean, a lot of us, that's what we grow up into. We grow up into these narratives that we live by that sort of are at the ground of who we are. We learn them early on, who's right, who's wrong. We learn what's ours, what's not ours. I'm certainly not telling you to have your grandchildren or your children go out and grab whatever they want. But at the same time, we teach people, our children, we teach people to separate ourselves from others. Even in sharing, I'm going to challenge this idea of sharing, because even in sharing, which is for the Christian church, is a lot like charity and acts of kindness. It's not bad. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying what it doesn't still recognize, it still sees us as separate, but we need to bridge that separateness a little bit by kindness, by helping others in need. When in fact, the story of interconnectedness says, I'm here because of you. I'm here because you're here. We are here together in this reality, in this mess. How can I make this mess continue forward? How can I participate in this reality? So the story of separation is kind of where we are in the Western world. The church picks it up. The church lives with it and propagates it. And depending on where you are in the spectrum, conservative or liberal, a lot of times the church even defines it more concretely, who's in and who's out. And again, as we talked about when we were talking about questions, a lot of this is rooted in our very neurobiology, right? So the other way of telling the story is this idea of interdependence, interconnectedness. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter from Birmingham jail, the amazing prophetic imagination that he had when he said, this is a man who grew up in this abused, oppressed reality of hatred. And yet he says in the midst of that reality, we are inextricably intertwined in our destinies. How do we see past the hate to realize we are inextricably intertwined? You know, when I listen on the radio or listen on news like the last several days, and I'm listening to the conflicts that I'm hearing happening, not just in the Middle East, but politically, it happened for the last several years, but it's been happening for several decades now. We don't debate. We talk past one another, right? We don't hear one another. We're already ready, positioned, our point of view, our stance. We talk past one another. We haven't communicated as a people in decades, if maybe we ever did. The challenge for us is to get past this idea, as Martin Luther King said, to find the inextricable, interwoven nature of our destinies. A.J. Jacobs, some of y'all know A.J. Jacobs. He's well known as a TV screenwriter as well as an author and a producer and just a really interesting creative person. He did a great TED Talk, and it's called How I Thanked Everyone Who Made My Cup of Coffee. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's a great TED Talk. What happened was he just decided, I'm grateful. I want to be grateful, and I want to find out how I can thank people for my coffee. The coffee he drank at home. The process ends up taking him weeks and weeks and even months as he realized there were over 10,000 people involved in the process that led to him having a cup of coffee in the morning. How much we take for granted in just doing our in enjoying our daily lives. How much we take for granted that the folks we are seeing have nothing to do with us, when in fact, they more than likely have everything to do with us. This is, I think, the challenge that the pandemic offered us a chance to see, right? The way in which we are related to our environment, the way we're related to nature, to all of the earth, plays an integral role in what we experience because of that relationship. The story of interdependence recognizes that we are here with one another, we are here with creation. It's a narrative view also that I think what Jesus was pointing to. If you follow his teachings, if you follow his life, he was always about including others where they had been excluded by the dominant religious orientation, the dominant religious guiding myth, which, if you think about it, is rooted in the very idea of covenant with the divine in order to be blessings to one another, to all the nations. This was the original covenant. I'm going to step on toes. I don't get how they don't get that in Israel. I don't get why we're still in the midst of conflicts in Northern Ireland and why we're still in the midst of conflicts in Israel. I mean, I get it. I understand why. I understand who did what. But I don't think we're thinking about why this is happening and continues to happen. And why, when we participate in it, we're not telling a better story without participating in a better way. The very root of the guiding myth was we are here for one another. Chosen creates this idea that we are separate from one another. The only thing we're chosen for is to tell a better story. The only thing we're chosen to do is to be a better mirror for a world to recognize the interconnectivity in the divine that we are at the very ground of our being in which we find ourselves. And this idea of shalom, which is about wholeness and balance, is what Jesus' life was all about. But it wasn't something new. Again, the new covenant idea, I think, is part of the myth of separation. Now, I'm stepping on all sorts of toes here, so I'm sorry. I'm conspiring to see the world in a different way, and I hope you'll co-conspire with me. Those of you who do continue to do so, but those of you who are thinking this is really strange, I hope you will co-conspire with me to try to find a better narrative, a better way of connecting to this wider narrative of interconnectedness. Because the church has been telling this story of separation for hundreds and hundreds of years. This idea of a new covenant, when what Jesus did was Jesus reminded people of their original covenant. He reminded Jewish people that they should be better Jewish people, if you will. He reminded us all that we belong to this larger family that is the family of God, the family of the divine, the family of all of life. And then he said something interesting in the Sermon on the Mount. If you remember the Sermon on the Mount, he gave these Beatitudes, which were these amazing teachings, sort of the core of his teaching, which is all about upending your life and seeing it in a new way in order that you might begin to see the connectedness of things. So it was decentering. Blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who are merciful. Blessed are those who suffer. Really? Yeah. What do you find out when you do that? You begin to open the doors of connection in ways you never thought. And then he said something really interesting right after that. He said, you are the salt of the earth, light of the world. And what I liked about that is that if you go back and you think about it, he wasn't complimenting them, right? Like when you talk about somebody who's the salt of the earth, just start off top of your mind, who you're thinking of, maybe someone comes to mind. It's good people, salt of the earth people. They're kind, they're humble, they're really good. It's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is saying you're all salt of the earth. Salt has to work in relationship to something, right? It doesn't work by itself. It only works in connection with something else, by bringing flavor to it, by enhancing the experience of it. Salt is about how we bring our lives to others' lives in ways that bring about greater depth, greater meaning, greater connection, greater hope, greater possibilities with those we encounter. That's what it means to be the salt of the earth. It's how we are in all of our moments. And then, again, how David Tacey said this, when we catch a glimpse of this deeper belonging, we suddenly feel at home in the universe, and we desire to work for the good of the whole rather than strive only to satisfy just the part of it. So I was listening to NPR this last week, and you've been listening to your radio stations and news, the conflict in the Middle East. And you might have heard the Palestinian woman who was being interviewed, and with her child, Palestinian woman, and talking about the Jewish neighbors across the street from them and how they often played. But you could hear the bombing in the background as they're being interviewed. And then they talk about, they just don't understand how to get past this, right? How do you get past this conflict when there are forces outside of your control that are fighting based on this narrative, this myth of separation? And so they find themselves hiding in one another's closets, hiding in the center stairways of their houses, hoping for the best. This myth of God's privilege, this myth of God's chosen, is much at the heart of a lot of our country. It's also at the root of white privilege. If anything else the pandemic has allowed us to do, it's allowed us to see ourselves perhaps a little more clearly, not necessarily more comfortably, but allowed us to see ourselves more in relationship to who we have been. And I don't mean us individually necessarily, but yes, we live in this system. We are part of this system, but us historically. You remember as children, right? You remember as children. You loved to watch the cowboy and Indian shows. Couldn't wait for the cowboys to get the Indians. That's only 60 years ago, 50 years ago. We know who the enemy is. We'll look 100 years from now, we'll look back and go, how did we figure the Russians were always going to be those people? We know inevitably we're going to see that we are more related to people around the world than we think we are. That's the only way the earth continues. That's the only way civilization continues. That's the only way life continues, is by recognizing our deep interconnectedness with one another and with all of life. And it's not going to be comfortable. It's going to be messy. Irish Catholic, Irish Protestants in Northern Ireland, Muslims and Christians here and abroad, Hutus and Tutsis, cowboys and Indians, Republicans and Democrats. The only way past all of that is to see the larger narrative of interconnectivity. And how do we do that when we're rooted in this? It's a part of our daily lives to be a part of this separation myth. It's such a challenge. The idea that, I know if you grew up like I did in the fundamentalism, you grew up with this idea of original sin, right? So even in your faith development, we had this notion of we weren't right with God. But in reality, that's a 4th, 5th century adaptation of the Christian message. Because the original Jewish understanding of the creation story wasn't a fall, wasn't a temptation and a fall. It was a celebration of enlightenment. It was a celebration of wisdom and enlightenment. They weren't banished from the garden. They were sent out into the world. This was the understanding of the earliest Jewish traditions, was that the original sin was, in fact, original blessing. That now we were to send out into creation, to be a part of it, and to help to guide creation and sustain creation, and then, of course, the covenant with Abraham, one another. But our fear and our divisiveness and the culture we grew up in and the narrative, which is at the root of who we are as a Western culture, but also who many of us are just in our own understanding, is this idea that we are separate. When Jesus says you're not separate at all, you're salt. How are you going to bring flavor to the moments, even the ones that are difficult, that are awkward? So I want to share just a quick thought of how we do this, and then a quick hope for us. Because I think it's a real challenge for us to begin to think, just as it is for us to be in places where we find ourselves disagreeing with people or in a disagreeable moment or an uncomfortable moment, and then to find ourselves saying, come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, it doesn't matter, you're welcome here. How can I open my arms? It's challenging in places we find ourselves because there's a lot of idiots out there. I mean, okay, you've never said that of anyone, I'm sure. I say it all the time. Right? I mean, we know who the stupid people are. We just don't look in the mirror. But we know who the others are. That's the challenge for us, is to recognize that's a myth of separation. The original blessing, the myth of the original blessing. By the way, when I'm using myth, I want you to understand I'm not talking about something that's not fact or fiction or whatever. Like I told you last week, George Saunders, the great writer, when he said that the one story that we get wrong as being nonfiction is our own. That's the one story we always get wrong as being nonfiction. We think that our stories, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we think about others is reality, when it's just where we are right now. Maybe we could be better at it. Maybe we could adapt our story. Maybe we could be something more. So when I say that we are living by myth, what I'm saying is we're living by a way of organizing our reality. And we've been doing that mostly by this idea of separation. So I want to suggest something here. John Steinbeck wrote this a long time back. He said, "We are lonesome animals. We spend most of our life trying to be less lonesome." If you're doing what we do here in 1111, you're making all the connections, right? That's why we pick the songs we pick, why we pick the rituals we do. He says, we're lonesome animals. We spend all of our life trying to be less lonesome. One of our ancient methods is to tell a story, begging the listener to say and feel, yes, that's the way it is. Or at least that's the way I feel it sometimes. And then he says, then you realize you're not alone, not nearly as alone as you thought. In hearing our stories, we're made whole. So the challenge for us, I believe, is to find this practice of listening to others' stories more intently. To let whatever comes at us as part of that myth of separation, that defensiveness, that stance, whatever comes at us, to let that pass by. Because you know and I know, we're a part of the myth of interdependence. We're a part of the myth of the ground of our very being, which connects all of life, connects us all. This is what we are a part of. We're made of the stars. We can look up at Orion's belt and see the middle star there and realize that's not a star. That's a galaxy with billions of stars inside that one star in the middle of his belt. We're a part of that. Feels overwhelming? But just think, you get to co-create that moment. And then the next moment, because we're a part of that reality. So how do we learn to practice this in a way? And one thing I want to suggest, two things then real quick as we wrap it up here. The first is start to recognize which story, which myth you're living by. Start to catch yourself when you find yourself living in a defensive stance, living in that judgmental stance, living in that stance that sees something else as apart from you. Start to think of ways in which you can see how you are connected to others, to the moment, to what you are doing even. And when you hear someone else telling you that story of defensiveness, try to catch yourself in a place where you don't react. We'll talk about this more in mindfulness, but try to catch yourself with a little more awareness so that instead of reacting, you are just letting that pass by. Because you know there is a larger story, a greater connective story. And begin to practice looking for those connections. And the second way that you can do that is again this idea that John Steinbeck said. Look for where you hear your own story. One of the things my mother did, when my mother dealt with alcoholism for years and years and years, she's not been with us now for about 6 years, I believe 5 years. One of the things that she said to me that I will never forget, because my mother grew up in a very socially oriented reality. She had to look this way, be married this way, have this house, be in this kind of context. She was living by the myth of separation. And then she had it all break apart, right? Like all of our lives, we experience these breaks, we experience these stumbles, we experience these big holes in our lives where we simply fall in, and how do we recover? With alcoholism, she found the connectivity with AA groups, of course, with other groups of shared story. But what she told me afterwards is she realized, she said, you know what? I never would have thought I'd have anything in common with those people. And then she smiled and she said, even saying those people feels so strange and wrong because they're my people and I'm their people. How do we begin to listen past those divisive myths, those divisive sort of images that are part of the myth of separation so that we can find the connection? And I think one thing is to listen for those connections, and the other one is to probe past it. I love the idea, next time you find yourself with someone who's got a conspiracy theory that they just can't wait to tell you, start listening to it. Start asking more questions. Start listening for what you're really hearing, which might be fear or anxiety. Start sharing a story about being a child and afraid. Ask them about a time they were a child and afraid. Don't simply throw up another myth of separation back. Remind one another that we are part of this greater connectivity of life. We are salt of the earth. That's how we begin to get a wider connection, a wider table, if you will.